Good evening.
Hello, how are you?
Fine. Doing okay, Lori?
I am doing okay, hanging in there.
Oh,
And you?
good. Yep. I'm staying busy. We're expecting our grandchild tomorrow.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, we're been waiting and waiting and waiting.
The worst part.
Yeah, well, they're inducing her. Started inducing her last night. So my daughter-in-law, and so we're just kind of waiting. I'm taking the rest of the week off because we want to be ready when the baby comes. And we're hoping tomorrow.
They've been inducing her since last night.
Yep.
Oh my God, that's horrible for her.
Yeah. Well, she's really she's tough. She's from she's Vietnamese. Well, technically she's Nguyen, and she's from the mountains of Vietnam. And they came here when she was a child, so they've got a real tough exterior. Being able to handle things, and I guess they had to, where they came from, and
I was induced with both of mine, and that 6 and 8 hours was the longest 6 and 8 hours of my life.
yeah. So we're on 24 hours right now, and they think they're not going to let her go longer than 72 hours. But she started having contractions today, so I suspect that it'll become more. Once she dilates, she'll be. I mean, they said she was 1 to 2 minutes on contractions, but unless I think, and they had to back off, the medication, and they're going to start doing pitocin tonight. So I'm not really sure that the contractions that she was initially having were, I guess, real contractions, because, I mean, she was only 1 centimeter. So,
Ooh.
yeah. But, she's 2 weeks early. They had to induce her because of the renal pelvis on both sides are expanding.
Uh-oh.
I wanted to make sure that it wasn't something that could resolve, and he may have to have surgery, within the next month. So we'll see. We're crossing our fingers that everything will work out just the way it should work out.
Things that we can't control.
Right. Let's see. It's 5:54. So let's see. Somehow last week I hit record. I didn't know I hit record. That was funny because I recorded everything before the class and there was just dead air.
That happens.
Yeah.
I think you're recording now, too.
Well, that's what I was looking at. I don't see it.
I can see it in the upper left-hand corner of my screen of you. It says
Zoom recording. All right. So we're into, I hope this works. Yeah, there we go. All right. So we're doing the determinants of learning, and I'm going to move this out of my way too so I don't get it mess up my presentation there. And since I look like left to right, it's easier for me to do that. All right, so determinants of learning, part one. I've split it up into 4 parts because there was so much material there. And so what I did is I looked at what y'all did this week in what you presented, and I'm trying to bring a different perspective because I don't want to go over and rehash the same thing. So the picture here represents possibly all of you teach. Do all of you teach? Okay, so the picture here represents all the people that you might come encounter with maybe on a campus and you might have in your class. So my question to you is, can you actually find the learning style for each of these individuals and teach to their learning style while also paying attention to the other 20 students that you have, or 30 students, depending on how many you have in your program or whether it's staff? Do you think you can do that effectively given the pressures you're under at your job? Anybody?
I mean, I think if you kind of tackle the subject matter in various different ways, audio, visual, kinesthetic, and kind of look at the classroom as you're going, I think you'll pick up clues on whether or not you're getting in or not.
Okay. So, and I think you're right. I mean, ultimately, you have to come at it. It's going to be difficult to learn everybody. And it's in the magical time that you have a student during that first semester, or whether it's an employee or a patient, it's that sort of, there are sort of different time periods. And for a student who comes into a program, you're looking at the first 2 weeks, and you'll lose a good number of students if you lose them in class, but you don't have time to learn their learning styles. So you're exactly right. You have to sort of give a broad spectrum antibiotic. You just kind of have to hit it with everything to hope that something sticks. So this is, like I said, this AI program is a little different. So I'm still struggling with how to format things. So I apologize if it's not quite normally the way you see it. But these are the objectives we're going to look at. We're going to look at the recognition of the principles of goals and learning, principal goal and learning, the level of Bloom's taxonomy, and how to properly select those things, because this is something you're going to need for your final project, but it also goes directly to what we're doing. All right, so I think all of you would agree that your role is multifaceted, whether you're working with a patient, student, or staff, but you've probably already determined it's not what you think it is. As we just talked about, you can't just really assess a student or a patient or a staff member effectively all the time. So how do you go about doing that effectively? Number one rule, and this actually comes from Socrates, know thyself. Now that goes for you, that goes for the student, that goes for the staff member, and ultimately what you want to get to the patient to the point where they know their self. Do they understand their condition? Do they understand how to manage that condition? They might already know how to do that. But if you really stop and think about it, this is pretty simple. But I love philosophy, and you're probably going to hate me for that, because I'll bring a lot of philosophy into education, because ultimately, we're going back to the time where we'll say true education began. And knowing thyself is probably one of the simplest things you can do to help a student, because if you can help them discover who they are, you can help them progress through your program. For a staff member, you can help them understand what a professional is, not just I can do my job. A professional is not someone who can do their job. It's a professional who's someone who can do their job with integrity, with respect for others, compassion, and sort of a sense of justice for others. But you have to instill that, and the only way you can do that is to get them to know themselves. By the way, does anybody know what I just quoted? Does anybody have any idea where that came from? Well, that is a philosophy from Nicomachean Ethics, written by Aristotle. And Aristotle was a student of Plato, and Plato was a student of Socrates. So all of this that I'm talking about, actually a lot of what we're talking about in learning comes from that era. All right, so last week we talked a little bit about NOW's, pedagogy versus andragogy, or the assumptions thereof. And I think I had this graphic up, can't remember, but these are the 6 assumptions. So remember, most of the time we would want to be on the andragogical side, which is that the student that we have, we're just going to refer to student, whether it's staff, student, or patient, okay? So the self-directedness, the self-concept. The andragogical principle is that most of your adult patients or adults will have that self-directedness, whereas children may not. So some of you who had, say, an asthmatic patient that chose to go that route, an asthmatic patient would be very different than, say, an asthmatic child would be very different than an asthmatic adult in terms of how to handle that learning process. Most of you made that distinction. The adult learner, see somebody, I'm going to have to mute here because I can't hear. The adult learner has the rich resource of their background. Think about it. All of you have backgrounds, and you probably use it on a daily basis. You always reflect on, this is the way we did it, and this is how I learned it, and and you come to the table with that, and other people learn from that, but you also learn from other people's experiences. The developmental task of social roles. Well, all of us are established in our social roles, so you've got a situation where your social orientation helps define who you are, and your place in the world. So you're more ready to take on new tasks. But if you think about when you go back to, say, Piaget's developmental from early childhood to adulthood, those biological and social development issues come into play more, and you have to work around those. So with someone who is an adult, they have that immediacy of application, that they see that, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the applications there later on when we get into building our objectives. And then they're problem-centered, and they have that intrinsic locus of control. Or that internal locus of control versus the external locus of control. If you really think about it, all of you have an internal locus of control because you're here, right? You can wave and say you agree or disagree or whatever. But you joined the master's program because you were driven. Either you could have been driven by extrinsic things, but I guarantee you there was probably a strong intrinsic value to the education, whether or not your employer required it or not. Most of the therapists that I run into, want to do it to advance themselves first. And I think that's the key. If you're doing it for the purpose of advancing yourself, whether it applies to your job or not, you are in the process of learning and improving yourself. And that's a good example for your students. So in your textbook, it talks about identifying gaps, desired versus actual performance. With a patient, you have to assess them. In order to assess them, you have to look at things like, how are you going to train them to take care of themselves, if that's your goal. If it's a student, we're in the process of learning, training, instruction, practice to achieve the success that we really want to achieve. But yet we have to constantly evaluate, provide feedback, and what we call close the loop in education, to make sure that that feedback is telling us that the success we're receiving is actually the success that we had intended to achieve, which goes directly to your objectives. Now, metaphorically, I put the Golden Gate Bridge here, as a metaphor for the fact that we're really building bridges in education. We're building the bridge, developing the scaffolding in order to hold up everything, to ensure that it just doesn't fall apart. But this is a constant process. Most of you, if you're involved in educational accreditation, it drives you crazy because every year you're having to do these things. But at the same time, it improves your program. You do it in the hospital too, but a little differently. Now let me ask you a question. Do you see these steps completed effectively in whatever setting you're in? Anybody can chime in.
Interestingly enough, I think we often skip 1 and 2.
And yes, exactly. And we also, too, particularly for, when you're talking about learning for patients, that's oftentimes really just overlooked. I think some of you mentioned in your presentations, the hospital setting, is actually one of the worst places to try to educate a patient because of everything that's going on and the fear factor there. So you really have to think about where you are setting-wise. And I'm not even sure, honestly, if we do step 3 that well. We collect the data about the learner from the learner after they've submitted an essay or a test or whatever. But the data we're talking about here is the data that this learner gives to us about themselves. That may not necessarily be in the form of a test, but it could be. I think number 4 oftentimes is missed too, because we don't involve if we're on a faculty, we may not involve other members of the faculty, but we really should. Talk about student, kind of like a post-conference clinical where you sit around the table and talk about student performance. Can help the members of the faculty help out. Of course, if you're in a small program, that's different. I think it should happen in a staff environment as well. And it certainly should happen and does happen if you're talking about patients, because if you've ever been involved in healthcare education, there's usually some type of post-conference that's done with all the team members. Your social worker, you have your nurse, you have your therapist, the doc, whoever, and you're all coming together and you're discussing the patient. And that makes it very effective. But you have to do 1 and 2 really well, because identifying the learner is not just about saying this is a student, this is a patient, and this is a staff member. It's also identifying what their learning styles or their preference for learning. So a lot of you used various different ways to figure out what methods to assess them. And again, it depends on circumstance. How many of you feel like it's a good idea to give a patient a questionnaire to determine what they need?
I think giving them a questionnaire to determine what they need or to find out what they think they need get you on the right steps as to maybe where you need to start or anything that you need to clear up.
Okay. Anybody else?
I think some patients, not all.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think? So if you had a combination of formal interview / informal conversation, do you think that would actually glean more information if you knew how to ask the right questions?
Yes.
Yeah. And you've already heard me harp about it in your presentations, and it wasn't a criticism, don't get me wrong. I mentioned motivational interviewing. Does anybody have any experience with that?
No.
All right, so I think if you don't, I think that's something that we need to touch on in a whole different lecture. But here's the thing. Think of having a conversation with someone, but having in your mind kind of the direction you want to take it. But the whole purpose of it is to evoke from the patient what they want, which you can't get from a questionnaire, because that questionnaire is fixed. In motivational interviewing, what we do is we start out with sort of that typical type of approach, but it quickly evolves to this organic conversation that we begin to have. But as you hear the answers to the questions that you're asking, you get the patient to elaborate, or you get them to evoke the meaning for them. It's to me, when I learned how to do it, we had a whole semester. We had a semester class just on motivational interviewing, and I got really excited about it because I could really see the applications in respiratory care, because it's something that's truly missed, a true interview of a patient. We check off the boxes, but that's not interviewing a patient. And so we have to be careful about questionnaires. Again, it's not wrong. I mean, I think it's a way to glean some information, just as long as I think what you have to do is triangulate the data, come up with at least 3 different ways to collect that data and see if it all matches. It's kind of what we do with students, right? We collect cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domain evaluations. We get those from student self-evaluations, from faculty's evaluations of the student, and the clinical preceptor evaluations. So we do all 3 levels, or should be doing all 3 levels, to be able to evaluate them. And then we compare that data to see, okay, are we all getting the same answer? Is the student really good at mechanical ventilation? Can they perform that at the proficiency level that they are required to do when they graduate? Or again, if a staff member, same thing. How many of you use those 3 levels in some form?
Cognitive, psychomotor, and affective?
Yes.
We use all 3.
Okay. But do you have your clinical sites, clinical preceptors, your faculty, and the students do the same evaluation, or is it a different evaluation?
Clinical faculty and preceptors are the same. I believe the students is slightly different.
I mean, it has to be a little bit different in terms of the wording, but ultimately what you're measuring is the same, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that's the goal, because what you want to do is you want to then be able to take it to the student and say, Here's where we see the gaps are, because their perception of their knowledge is different than your perception of their knowledge. And it's not just our perception of their knowledge, but it's the perception of the clinical affiliate or preceptor knowledge. So, it's much better when we have those inputs. And it's also much better when we have those inputs when they're independent, because that way we're not biased, which can easily happen, particularly if you have a student with a really bad attitude. You probably had that, or a staff member for that matter, or a patient, I guess, either way. But the gaps analysis, which is discussed in the chapter, I think is a really effective tool. I think I mentioned that last week. But one of the things at the board that we always say is that when we see therapists who lack competency, and that's why they're in front of the board, it's because they don't know what they don't know. And that's a very dangerous person in a clinical setting, because they think they know, but they don't know what they don't know, and they make mistakes. Did anyone see the AARC posting this week about Do It for Drew?
No.
Okay. I would encourage you to go to the AARC website, look up Do It for Drew. The event that is described in the story happened in North Carolina. I happened to be the executive director my first day. I had to take the call from the father of the son who had died in the hands of a respiratory therapist. That was my first contact with the public. So I'd like for you to read the story, because it will really drive home when we have gaps in knowledge, particularly in our field, between the performance, desired performance, and the actual performance. It can really be hazardous, literally lethal. And that's what happened. Someone who had all of the credentials in the world, but had only been a therapist for 6 months, didn't know how to respond to the airway. And that's because there was a gap in actual experience. Unfortunately, there was no gaps analysis. The analysis was the patient died. Every time that father calls me to this day, his emotions are very difficult to deal with, because he still cries when he talks to me. And this has been almost 6 years ago. And I can understand. He was 13 years old when he died. So the gap model, which you did a SWOT analysis. So the gap analysis goes along with the SWOT analysis, but we did it out of order. Technically, the gap analysis should have been done first, followed by the SWOT, I think. That's my opinion. Because what the gap does, you're looking at what your current performance is versus what you want to go to. The SWOT analysis will uncover, the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? But what this will do, first, you got to identify. And I think you sort of did the gap analysis by kind of picking it out of the hat of what you saw. But a true gap analysis would involve everybody in your department or anybody in the faculty or on a care team to look at where we are, not just your perspective, because there will probably be many more issues that you need to address. But once you have the gap analysis and properly identify what those gaps are, then you can address it more effectively with the SWOT. Now, in the gaps analysis or the SWOT analysis, well, particularly the gaps analysis, what you're constantly doing, as I mentioned, is going through this evaluation and follow-up. In education accreditation, we call this closing the loop. And once you close the loop, it's not over. What it does is it helps you stop for a second and say, what could we do to improve? And, have we closed that gap? This is something we did on a yearly basis as we analyzed our matrix performance, the student performance on the exam versus what was on the matrix versus what the clinical site said students' weaknesses were. So we were constantly looking at this. And so here's what one would actually look like if you did one. Obviously you have to collect the data. You got 2 examples here, and I chose these specifically because they go to healthcare, obviously, but they've gotten the first one, 40% of the patients 65 and older in our community health clinic are receiving pneumococcal vaccine consistent with national guidelines. What I like to do is look at how they identified it first. They used audits of the charts and interviews with nurses. The only thing they're missing is in this is a third level of data. Why did they only talk to nurses? Why didn't they, obviously if it's a clinic situation, there are doctors involved. Wouldn't the doctors also be involved in the interviews, or shouldn't they be? So that I question that, but it doesn't matter because their desired state was 100% needed those pneumococcal vaccines. That's ideal, but do you think it's realistic? Does anybody think 100% would be realistic?
No.
I mean, I always said I wanted 100% of my students to pass the RRT exam. Was that realistic on the first try? And my dean would always say, well, I don't really think you're being realistic, but I would say, but that's what I want them to do. That's my desired state. So even if it's not realistic and that's your desired state, what it does, it always gives you something to work towards. But there's a 60% gap. I think the best way to work something like this is to have a year 1, year 2, and a year 3 approach in a gaps analysis. Year 2 of after the gap, maybe 80%. And then year 3, 90%, and by year 3, 100% by year 3. So, because that's a big jump. But if you don't have the target, you won't achieve it. And then you've got another one down here. I love this one. Current state, nurses are unfamiliar with the process of scholarly publication. The needs assessment showed 70% of the nurses reported low levels of knowledge and confidence in writing the publication process. How many nurses do you know that would confide in you that they didn't know that? I found it a little humorous, but they did this, and that's what the nurses reported, and then the number of nurses publications are below target. Well, they didn't state what the target was, nor did they say what the target desired state was. So the gaps analysis in this situation is not well designed, because do they want 100% of the nurses aware of the process of scholarly publication? Well, it may be. But is it realistic, if someone is not in a position to write publications, is it even worth them doing it? I think it is, but they don't have it clearly stated as to what their desired result is. So if you've got an objective that you want to achieve, in this case, a desired state, you need to state something that can be measured, because how are you going to measure something? In the first one, we can measure it. We could say, well, this year we got 90%, so we improved over last year. But in the desired state in the second example, it's kind of hard. It's kind of fuzzy to me. All right, so just stop here for a second. Do you have any questions about the first part? If anybody's listening to the recording, just take a pause here before you go on to the next part, because I don't want you to get overloaded. How do you see this program, the AI program? Do you think it presents better than PowerPoint? I'm curious.
I'm a big believer in anything but PowerPoint, and I almost never use it anymore. So to me, it's better, but.
Okay. I just like the way for some reason, it's softer on my eyes, and it's more appealing to my eyes. And I agree with you. It's, it's something other than PowerPoint. It's a little more challenging at first, but once you get it going, it's pretty quick. All right, so we looked at peak readiness, and the reason I'm bringing this out rather than learning styles, because really peak readiness isn't a learning style, right? We're looking at what are the factors, the physical, emotional, knowledge, and experiential factors in terms of readiness. So we have to peak into the readiness. That comes from the 1990 article, actually. But my question is, does it break down this evenly? I see some heads shaking. Yeah, no.
I think
Okay.
especially for patients, especially in the hospital, there's likely one or two of these that are more or less compromised than another.
No, I agree with you there.
And I think it's probably a moving target. You may have more emotional, just learning time, and less emotional and mixed learning time. I don't think it's stagnant. I think it probably moves.
Yeah, it's a moving ball. Yep, I agree with you 100%. But just for purposes of illustration, there's no way to do that, because you would have infinite possibilities of percentages, right? So just for purposes of this, just to kind of break it down, we're looking at 4 things. And theoretically, they break down into 25% or quarters, if you will, but not realistic. And of course, from the peak model, you actually, many of you presented on this, and I think that's a good thing to do, because what you're doing is assessing the situation. The only one I have an issue with really is gender. I understand where they're coming from the peak readiness, because I'm a male, and I understand I don't like to go to the doctor. I don't like to do what the doctor wants, but I think we have to be careful of assumption. Just because someone is a male doesn't mean that will be the case. Just like, this day and time is very hard to tell. You never want to make an assumption based on, for example, their cultural background. But you're not making assumptions. But I think if you turn it around and are sensitive to these things, that these are things that might come into play, and some more than others, as we just talked about. I think really for me, because I studied emotional issues to a large extent, I do think probably out of all 4 of these, number 2, the emotional readiness probably impacts learning more than anything, whether it's a patient or a staff or a patient. And that's where the challenge comes in, because whatever you figure out otherwise is going to be impacted about how they feel, because it's in our DNA, right? We're going to respond or react. If somebody responds to a medication versus react to a medication, which would you rather them do? What does react conjure up?
Emotion.
Okay, but if it's a medication, is it a good effect or a bad effect?
Typically an adverse reaction or a side effect or a bad result.
Yeah, but if the doctor says you're responding to the medication or responding to the treatment, that's interpreted as positive, right?
More positive, yeah.
Right. So even though we kind of sometimes interchangeably use them, the reality is that it's how we look at it. If you're having an allergic reaction, you're having an allergic reaction. That's a bad thing. But if it's a beta blocker and your heart rate's coming down, that's what it's supposed to do. Unless, of course, your blood pressure bottoms completely out. That's not a good thing. But there's always those that balance there. And I think emotional issues. There are a couple others I would add here to the emotional side that we don't really get into in education as much, and that would actually be the person, how it impacts the spirit of the individual. I'm a big believer in the spirituality of the individuals impacted by all of these things. But it's not spirituality in terms of religion, but it's how they see themselves. For example, how do your spirits are up today, your spirits look down today. We talk in those terms all the time, because we're looking at the person's physical appearance, and we're seeing that their shoulders are hunched and their eyes are gazed downward. And we have a sense of their lack of esteem. And it's almost like their spirit is broken. So we might say, why are your spirits down today? It's just the way we think and talk about it, but it really goes to the heart of the matter. So emotional readiness can impact a lot of things, particularly when it comes to learning. In Now's teaching methods, there's a lot of good information about the role of the learner. And I think I wanted to really focus on readiness to learn, since that's what we're talking about. If you go to andragogical principles here, any change is likely to trigger a readiness to learn. For that andragogical principle to be in play for an adult, when you start talking to them about something they're interested in, it triggers their desire to know more. And that's the key here. They need to know in order to perform effectively. The adult learner in particular wants to know why. Whereas a student who is maybe a high school student or a grade student, all they want to know is how to do it so they can get past that task and move on. They're less worried about the why. My first experience with this was when one year I had 3 former medics in my program. And all three of them came up to me and said, I am so afraid of actually doing anything now because when I was in the Army, I just had to know how. I said, but now that I know the why behind it, it scares me. And these were people who saw combat because they were taught in a more pedagogical fashion that you just do this, you do this, you do this, and all will be well. But now you're introducing what? The unknown to them. And I was surprised. I didn't expect that from them. I can tell you they were the best performing students we ever had. And that was one of the best groups I ever had. But it took a while for them to understand that, knowing the why will make them better at the how. Does that make sense? All right, so this is part 3. For those of you that are listening at home, take about a 2-minute break. For those of you that are here with me, we can move on if you would like. Did you have any questions? Yeah. Oops. Okay, I'm going to have to just warn you. In this section, I'm going to have to take off my headset. So it's going to make a loud noise because the only way I can have you listen to what I'm going to have you listen to is if I take off my headset. So I won't be able to hear you because my headset's off. But what is the evidence regarding the learning style principles? I'm going to take one that no one really talked about in their presentation, and that is the theory of right versus left brain. Let me ask you a question, and you probably have had these students. Do you have students that think with a half a brain? Staff members that think with a half a brain? Do you think they might appear to think with half of their brain? Let me put it that way. In other words, you think, God, what are they thinking? But in reality, if the right side controls the left side controls the right side, how could we be right brain or left brain? And not just whole brain. Have you ever thought about that? Now, it's true, the functions of the right and the left have been discovered, and we know what the dominants are, but you couldn't do, as logical as you are, or as creative as you are, depending on which side you fall on more so, you couldn't do without the other because the logic informs the creative informs the logic. Anytime we have a scientific theory, it doesn't come from science. What does it come from? Initially.
Imagination, something that you created, thought up, then you see if it works.
Okay, oops, sorry. I don't know where my button is, so this is not working like I had intended. Okay, so, there it goes. Hold on just a second. Let's get this 4 minutes out of the way and we'll get right back to it. Okay, hold on.
Dr. Croft, we can't really hear the audio.
I don't think he can hear us because he took his microphone off.
Yeah, I think so. We'll just have to let him know at the end. Maybe you can just send a link out or something.
Oh, Laura did already. He must be taking a break.
Hopefully you could hear that.
Not at all.
Huh?
Not at all.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wish you had hollered at me. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll send that video to you. But basically, what it was talking about was how the right and left brain theory has been debunked. And that's why scientists now are saying, for example, learning styles are not real, because we're basing a lot of this on brain science that now has been rethinking brain science, right? So as far as how it actually pans out, I mean, certainly there are those things that we know from patients who have brain damage, they have to relearn, but sometimes they can really relearn it. And, you know, we found out from stroke patients that if we get them up and walking, they will learn much faster, relearn those things much faster after a stroke. 50 years ago, once they had a stroke, they were just assumed to have the brain damage and it was permanent. They also thought a lot of things, a lot of myths about things that if you go back in history that exist that we thought at one time, you know, was what it was, but not really. How many of you, we have Columbus Day, right? And what's the biggest myth about Columbus Day?
That he discovered America.
Right. Did he discover America?
There's already people here, so somebody discovered it before him.
He never set foot in America.
Yeah, that's true too.
All right. So, but that's what they teach, right? That myth. I mean, he discovered what's south of the border to us. But as far as when we talk about America in the terms of modern times, he never set foot on our portion of the continent. I mean, there are tons of myths. I mean, you know, at one point in history, people thought the world was flat. You know, or you know, if you didn't believe in certain things, you were a heretic and you were burned at the stake for it. I mean, just because of the way things were at the time in history, and those myths being exposed as we learned. And you know, when we got in, I can get into a whole conversation about this, but I don't want to because my wife will kill me. But I really am into the medieval period, particularly from the Reformation to the Renaissance, through the Renaissance. And I used to teach a class on how King Henry VIII and his 6 wives changed the face of medicine. And that's like a far-reaching stretch of an imagination, because the reality is, I made the argument to my professor once that because Queen Elizabeth became queen, and because of the way the Articles of Injunction she passed in 1559, the establishment of the Church of England, that established the common man's ability to read the Bible. That forever changed England, because it broke away from from Rome. It broke away from the church, the Catholic Church, but it gave the power to the people to read the Bible, and being able to read for the first time expanded knowledge. And everything that went from there, I don't want to get into it, but the point is that things in history there are tipping points in history, and that was a tipping point in history. So part 4, what really determines learning? Last week we talked about this aspect. I want to draw your attention, to this again. And the reason is because one of the first things you do with a student is get their attention with information. But the problem is, how do you get it into long-term memory? Because, for patients, you have very little time with them by comparison to a student or a staff member. So when we actually give them new information, we're getting their attention, but that's all we're doing. Remember, within the first day, they're losing the majority of that information. And if they're a patient with very low educational background, it can even be worse, because they may not have been paying attention to you because you lost them after the first word. Like trying to use a word like pathophysiology in a conversation with them probably isn't a good idea, because they aren't going to understand what that is. Again, we talked about 8th grade. Teaching at the 8th grade level would be the maximum level we would teach. But you're drawing attention by presenting information. But then it has to go through several stages, and just like with evaluation, it has to go through loops. and loops and loops. That's where practice comes in. And we say that practice makes perfect, but you probably already always heard another phrase of that is perfect practice makes perfect. So I would have my students go into the lab and practice, right? And I would go in and evaluate them. And the first thing they would say, but I wouldn't do it this way. I said, well, why don't you do it the way you're supposed to? Well, I'm not going to do it that way in clinical. And I'd say, but if you do it in lab this way, you're going to do it in clinical that way. No, I won't do that. I know exactly what to do. Have you ever had students do that to you? Anybody? Yeah, I see Lori shaking her head. Yeah, it's probably one of the most annoying things because if they don't learn the steps of how to do a procedure, that it only takes one error to make a big difference. As I mentioned, the do it for Drew situation. But here's the other reason. Once you get their attention, that's all you're doing is you might help them remember to understand a little bit. But this is a take on Bloom's taxonomy. And if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, the highest order of thinking or performing is at creation level. That's what you're doing in this program. You're performing analysis. You're doing evaluations. You're doing creation. And the reason is because when you get down to it, the retention rates for information, even though you're struggling, is that when you're in discussion groups, practicing by doing and teaching others, look at how the difference in the retention rates are from a lecture or reading or audio-visual. In other words, those visual learners or those auditory learners really not getting as much out of it as we think they are because they actually have to put it to use. Now, you might say, well, that means they're kinesthetic. Well, the reality is that we're all three. And some students would do better by doing the kinesthetic action first, whereas some students might like to know a little bit about it first. It all depends, but ultimately, if you have a group of students, I forgot who said it earlier, it might have been Christy or Lori, I can't remember, was talking about that it's really all three, and you're exactly right, you're 100% right, it's all three, but you have to realize that if you can get your students, say second-year students or your senior staff members teaching your junior staff members or the freshman students, they will actually do better themselves because they have to go back and refresh themselves on certain things, but they do much better. That's one of the things that we used to do our last semester of our senior year for our students is have them go in and teach the students in lab, and we would observe them teaching. And they loved it. They absolutely loved it. But the reason they loved it was because not only were they showing what they were doing, but they were learning, and we were learning about them. I get excited. I used to get all excited about that because it was just one of those times where I could sit back and watch the learning process literally in action. So what is it then if learning styles really don't matter? The right brain, left brain theory isn't real. As we think we know it. This is what it is. The meaning for a learner will give you your desired outcome. In other words, we want to know as learners the what, the where, who, how, when, but most importantly, why. If you can give meaning to what you're teaching, however that form is, whatever style you choose to present it, if you can reach them and give them their why. I mentioned the Facebook group that I'm on. One of our themes is know your why. Why are you doing this? And it helps clarify for the person so much in regards to why am I doing this exercise? Why am I filling out this form? Or why am I doing? Because it gives meaning to them. They want to know. And when you give that to them or help them, let me rephrase that. You cannot give them their why. You have to help them uncover their why. That's sort of the goal. Well, that is actually the goal of learning. And really, when we talk about questions, I go back to philosophy because that's where it all started. I'm sure you're familiar with the Socratic method. I don't know if you're familiar with Aristotle's work. We had to read and use his original works in what we were doing in our dissertations, as well as our thesis of various different topics. But we had to reflect back on his theories of whether it had been rhetoric or ethics. And what's interesting is what came out of the ethics course that I had to take was a revision of the Code of Ethics for Respiratory Therapy in North Carolina. We took much of what I learned in the Aristotle course and translated it into a Code of Ethics. So even though it's ancient text, it still has modern meaning because he really gave us our scientific method. And, you know, I'm a huge fan of his. Now, Socrates not as much, just because in reality is Socrates was more of a teacher by asking questions only. And it can be extremely frustrating if you simply use nothing but the Socratic method. Although, with that said, are you familiar with, you use these all the time probably, and some of those would be like clarification questions that you might ask a student. What do you mean by? Could you put it another way? What do you think is the main issue? Could you give us an example? Could you expand upon that further point? If you've ever been on rounds at the hospital with residents, you probably have seen the Socratic method in action. And some people might interpret it as sort of a third degree. And there's a way to deliver these questions that doesn't interrogate the student, but it instead interrogates the question. What I mean by that is when we ask clarifying questions, the goal is not to interrogate the student, although it comes out that way, but it's to really drill down into the why, you know, trying to get to the answer. What's the meaning? And oftentimes when people use the Socratic method, particularly in healthcare, they're beating somebody over the head with questions, trying to trip them up so they can say, ha ha, I got you. You know, you don't know what you think you know. Has anybody ever seen that? Experienced it, possibly? All right, so let me ask you a quick question because I don't know your background. When you went to school, did you go on rounds with the residents? Anybody?
No.
Oh, wow.
We did, but I think there was a physician or two, but that model has really changed, or at least it's been my experience, where there's just not as much of that happening as there, I think, used to be. Right.
Well, I don't disagree that it's changed, and I think that's a sad part of it because every Wednesday morning we would have to go on rounds with the residents at Duke University. They would put us in the same room, ask us the same questions that they did with residents. And I had a case. You just never forget these things. I was in clinical, and I was told by the director, "Don't worry about presenting tomorrow because you got 6 patients spread out over PACU, SICU, and the NICU." And he said, "Don't worry about it." He said, just get the basics down. Well, I didn't. I got all my work done. I spent hours and another hour after clinicals gleaning information about these patients. I get to the X-ray room the next morning. The X-rays that came up were all the patients that I had. I was asked to give a report on each and every one of them. And fortunately, I took the time to write down enough information that I could squeak by. On the last patient, there was a swan in the patient. And the swan, the pulmonologist, now they didn't ask a question of the residents. They were just questioning us as respiratory students. He asked me to begin at the beginning of where the tip of the swan was and trace it all the way out through the body. Now, that would probably get anybody shaking in their boots, one, because you got all these residents staring at you. But, when you get challenged like that with questions after questions after questions, and even if you don't know the answer, what it does is it challenges the mind. And that's really what the Socratic method's about. It's about challenging the mind, but it has to be done in a way that doesn't beat the student up. And a staff member might take it completely wrong. They might take it as, you're trying to, get them out the door. So this is a stanza from one of my of late favorite songs. Has anybody seen A Star Is Born?
The what?
A Star Is Born with Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga. Okay, really good movie. And if you really dig into the movie, all the songs were original songs written and sung by Cooper and Lady Gaga. But this one in particular is one of my favorite, about letting the old ways die. And it actually got me to thinking about this. And that's why I put it up here. So Socrates' point of view was, I can teach anybody anything. I can't not teach anybody anything. I can only teach them to think. And everything I read this week, a lot of you wanted to make or help students with their critical thinking. And in order to help them with their critical thinking, you have to get critical with them, meaning that you have to question them. And I don't mean, again, not interrogating them, but questioning them. And so we can take the old and apply it to the new. And if you look at step 2 in the move towards critical thinking, it's develop appropriate questions, employ questioning techniques, and encourage interactive discussions. And that's what that is in the modern day, is the Socratic method in action. When you combine it with the things that we do today with feedback and assessment and closing the loop guidelines and determining the objectives, all of that starts to fit together. In other words, if we throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, if we throw out the questions, we throw out the biggest learning tool that we have. And it helps you actually assess the student or staff member's real ability to respond or react in certain situations. So the Bloom's taxonomy, I want you to pay attention to Bloom's taxonomy, particularly when you look at your final project. What you want to do, depending on your audience, if you're working with a patient, you might be working at the lower rung here. If you're working with students, you need to be working at the top rung, which means that you need to go in and rewrite your learning objectives. If you're teaching graduate students or baccalaureate degree students, they should be able to appraise or argue or defend or judge or select as part of that learning objective. If you have them just identifying and remembering things, then that's really just what we would expect out of a first-year student in respiratory school. So when I mentioned this, I think in everybody's post, not because I was being critical, but just to remind, to introduce this concept. Has anybody really looked at Bloom's taxonomy in the past?
A little.
It can.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, sorry. So we use it reasonably extensively in a course design.
Right.
Boise State. So yeah.
Okay. So, if you work at a college level, you certainly should be using it. But I see a lot of times in staff development, this is not used, mainly because people don't know how to use it. And that's really one of the reasons you're here is, how do you write a goal? How do you write an outcome? Because Stephen Covey, if you've ever read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, step two, or the second habit is always begin with the end in mind. And if you begin with the end in mind, getting to that end is much easier. But if you don't know what your end is, and it's not clear as to what that end is, then you're not going to be able to develop a really good module directed it towards that. So you're developing a module for a particular project. Do you want them to analyze, evaluate, and create? I think if you're working with staff or students, you always want to hit at some point all 3 of those. In order to be able to analyze, they certainly have to do the other things. That's why you don't bother with remembering and understanding, but rather get them to analyze, because to be able to analyze, they have to do the 3 bottom portions as well. Does that make sense? Because in other words, you don't have to write an objective for remembering if you're having them analyze. You might, depending on the topic and the setting, but maybe not in the case of the student. Here's a good read for you. If you want to get, this is Do Learners Really Know Best? Urban Legends in Education. It's a little bit more radical than things that you probably see in your textbook. But I'm always a big believer in looking at evidence and what does the evidence say? Otherwise, if we don't look at the evidence, then just like in medicine and healthcare, if we don't look at the evidence and do the best thing for the patient, we are committing malpractice. And there's such a thing called educational malpractice, where you're implementing practices that either are not proven or are those practices were not based in good evidence to begin with, so they haven't been proven or disproven, but they have. The point is that you want to look at it just like you would healthcare. Do you want to commit educational malpractice? I don't think anybody would, and no one intentionally does. But what they don't realize is if they leap into the newest, greatest thing on the planet Earth, because someone came to their college and said, you know what, this is a really good idea. We think this is the way to teach students, and it will hit your millennial students. The more hype you hear, just remember, it probably won't work out the way they say it will, and nothing's as good as they make it out to be. When I reflect back on the Socratic method, that's held the test of time, almost 3,000 years, regardless of what era you look in. Some of the greatest philosophers throughout our history did nothing but ask questions. And it's philosophy that informs science. Science does not inform philosophy. Every scientific discovery started out with a philosophy of something. Science, through Aristotle's work, helped develop the scientific method to prove that it existed or did not exist, to prove the hypothesis or the null hypothesis. But this is a good read if you want to take the time to read. You can just look it up on Google it, and it's got a lot of perspective to give you. And it's not to say what you're learning is, we'll just say, not real. It's just that you need to have that sort of perspective, that not everything is going to work exactly the way that the people that offer these things say it is. So what are my conclusions? If you have more questions now, you're thinking, thus learning. The answers lie within, as Socrates would say. Help others find their why, and the how will be much easier. You can change their world through proper questioning. So think about your students, think about yourself, think about what you're going through. And the more questions that are thrown at you, the more struggle you have to go through, and the more you overcome, the more you learn, even though you think that, this is a total waste of time. And sometimes it does seem like a total waste of time. I understand that. But it is important. And, I always tell people this, I'm a big believer in process. You go through the process and let the process kind of play itself out, and things will work out the way they're supposed to. Well, that's all I really have tonight. We're just a little bit over. I apologize on that. Any questions?
Not right now.
All right. Well, thank you for showing up. That really helps to talk to somebody other than the screen. And it's nice to have people to talk to, because ultimately the learning process requires collaboration. And I think I've got everything graded for you. So just make sure that you make sure you can read my comments, because I, for some reason, cannot post within the discussion board. I can post everywhere else, but it will not let me post in the discussion board. I'm going to have to ask Dr. Costner what's going on with that. But I will figure that out, because there was a couple of times I wanted to respond, and I tried and I tried and I tried. So it wasn't lack of trying. But anyway, I will be sort of sporadic this week. My grandson's going to be born hopefully tomorrow. So as soon as he's born, we're going to be going to visit our grandchild. So it's our first.